What if the truth of a film was never captured on set at all, but buried later, slipped into locked vaults, overwritten by safer visions, or cut apart until only the shadows of the original intent remained? In Hollywood, the brightest lights often hide the deepest fractures, and the most expensive productions sometimes unveil the secret studios work hardest to keep out of sight. Behind every glossy marketing reel lies another narrative, one built from compromises, reshoots, replacements, and the quiet erasure of a filmmaker's voice. From the outside, these films looked like blockbusters, icons, or award contenders. But inside the editing bays, power struggles rewrote destinies frame by frame. Directors were replaced after months of shooting. Entire stories were bent into shapes that pleased executives more than audiences. Some films existed twice, one version crafted with conviction, and another rebuilt under pressure. Others were stitched together by hands that were never meant to touch them. Tonight, we return to 5 movies whose real stories were never meant to see the light. They were questioned, reworked, reshaped, and in some cases reborn after their defeats. These are the 5 films that revealed what Hollywood tried to hide. Film 1, Justice League, 2017. It began as a film designed to unite heroes, yet it became the clearest example of how a studio can divide a vision. Justice League was never simply a movie. It was the battlefield where 2 opposing interpretations collided, leaving behind a patchwork of tones, intentions, and the quiet echo of what it was supposed to be. When Zack Snyder first shaped the project, he imagined a mythic world where gods walked among mortals, guided by tragedy and unity in equal measure. Warner Brothers, anxious after earlier controversies, wanted something brighter, lighter, safer. The production spiraled into uncertainty after Snyder stepped away due to a private tragedy. Joss Whedon was brought in with a mandate to rework the tone, reshape the characters, and reshoot substantial portions of the film. Months of photography were replaced in weeks, color palettes shifted, dialogue rewoven, and emotional arcs altered until the film resembled neither director fully. On release, audiences sensed the fracture instantly. The surface presented a streamlined, quippy, polished superhero adventure, but beneath that sheen lay abrupt tonal shifts, unresolved threads, and glimpses of another story struggling to break through. The theatrical cut became a symbol of interference rather than intention, a version held together more by obligation than conviction. Fans detected the seams where 2 visions collided and rallied behind the belief that another, hidden cut existed, one truer to the original design. Years later, that belief materialized. The Snyder Cut emerged like a lost artifact recovered from deep water, revealing the scale, weight, and earnest melancholy that had once defined the project. It wasn't merely a longer version, it was a reminder of how completely a story can transform depending on who is allowed to finish it. Sometimes the greatest conflict in a superhero film isn't on screen, it's the silent war fought over the final frame. Film 2 Solo, A Star Wars Story, 2018. It was meant to be a lighthearted return to a galaxy where adventure came easily, but behind the scenes, Solo became a lesson in how quickly freedom can vanish when a franchise fears losing control. What started as a spirited, improvisational take on an iconic character slowly transformed into one of the most dramatic directorial reversals in modern blockbuster history. Phil Lord and Chris Miller were originally chosen to bring a fresh, comedic rhythm to young Han Solo's journey. Their approach leaned into spontaneity, looser dialogue, and the unpredictable swagger that defined the character. Yet Lucasfilm soon grew uneasy. The improvisation, the shifts in tone, the expanding deviations from script, all of it signaled a direction the studio felt drifted too far from the familiar Star Wars identity. Weeks before completing filming, the directors were dismissed, leaving the production in a state of uncertainty that few major films had endured so far into the shoot. Ron Howard stepped in with the daunting task of reworking the film while keeping its spirit intact. Entire sequences were reshaped, character dynamics softened or redefined, and large portions of the movie reshot. What emerged was a hybrid, part daring experiment, part cautious restoration. The promotional campaign pushed the charm, the action, the nostalgia, but beneath the trailers lay a film that had lived 2 lives, each pulling the other's shadow behind it. Viewers sensed the friction. Some moments felt daring and free, while others echoed a more restrained, traditional tone. Solo became a movie caught between contrasting philosophies, one that hinted at what might have been while delivering what the studio felt was safe. Its legacy is not a story of failure, but a reminder of how fragile creative direction can become when fear outweighs trust. Sometimes the boldest journeys are not the ones taken on screen, but the ones abandoned along the way. Film 3: American History X, 1998. It was a film built on confrontation, but the fiercest battle wasn't between the characters on screen, it was the struggle over who truly controlled the story. American History X is remembered for its raw performances and unflinching message, yet beneath the surface lies one of the most intense director-studio conflicts in modern cinema. Tony Kaye approached the project with a stark, almost documentary-like vision. He wanted a film stripped of sentiment, one that confronted ideology with harsh honesty and refused to soften its edges. Edward Norton, delivering one of the most defining performances of his career, approached the role with equal intensity, seeking to deepen emotional arcs and expand scenes he felt would strengthen the narrative. During post-production, these two visions began to collide. Norton was invited into the editing room, where he shaped a cut emphasizing redemption and transformation, while Kaye pushed for a colder, less forgiving interpretation. The studio found itself in the middle of this creative fissure. New Line Cinema favored Norton's version, believing it more accessible and emotionally grounded. Kaye resisted fiercely, requesting alternative credits and distancing himself from the film he no longer felt represented his intent. The version released to the world was one shaped through negotiation rather than unity, a fusion of ambition, artistry, and fraught compromise. Audiences encountered a powerful, emotionally charged film, unaware of the storm behind it. The theatrical cut carried the weight of two competing visions, one clinical and austere, the other deeply human. The result is a haunting portrait, not only of hatred and change, but of the fragile balance between artistic authorship and studio control. Sometimes the most revealing story isn't the one a film tells, but the one it survives. Film 4: Exorcist. The Beginning, 2004. Some films are haunted not by their demons, but by the versions of themselves that never reached the screen. Exorcist. The Beginning stands as one of the rare cases in Hollywood where two separate films were carved from the same script, each reflecting a different fear, one from the story, the other from the studio. Paul Schrader was initially entrusted to revive the Exorcist legacy with a psychological approach. His vision leaned into slow-burning dread, the corrosive weight of faith, and the internal fractures of a man losing his certainty. It was a film about spiritual erosion rather than jump scares, shaped with restraint and introspection. But when the studio viewed the early cut, discomfort settled in. They expected spectacle, shock, and a more traditional horror experience. What they saw instead felt too meditative, too quiet, too far from the formula they believed audiences demanded. Schrader was removed, and Renny Harlin was brought in to reshape the project almost from the ground up. Sets were rebuilt, characters rewritten, entire arcs discarded in favor of a louder, more aggressive tone. Harlan's version pushed for energy and immediacy, leaning into violence, chaos, and spectacle. What emerged was a film dramatically different from its original intent, a production that carried the ghost of a story erased before it ever had a chance to exist. When Schrader's version was eventually released under a separate title, viewers saw the contrast clearly. One film whispered its horror with psychological weight, the other shouted it. Both were incomplete reflections of the same idea, fractured by the fear that the original might not conform to expectations. Sometimes the scariest thing for a studio isn't a demon on screen, it's a quiet vision they don't know how to market. Film 5: Supernova, 2000. It was supposed to be a sleek, stylish sci-fi thriller, but Supernova became something far stranger, a film no one wanted to claim, shaped and reshaped, until it felt less like a completed work and more like a distress signal from deep space. Few productions in Hollywood have ever shifted course so many times, leaving behind a trail of competing visions and abandoned attempts. Originally directed by Jeffrey Wright, the film set out to explore isolation, desire, and the dangers of encountering the unknown. But creative disagreements emerged early, and Wright departed, leaving the project drifting. Walter Hill stepped in next, attempting to steer the narrative toward a lean, character-driven thriller. Yet as post-production unfolded, the studio again grew uneasy. Hill's version, restrained and understated, was deemed too slow, too subtle, too far from the energetic sci-fi experience MGM wanted to sell. He withdrew his name from the final product, unwilling to attach himself to what was coming. In a last effort to salvage the film, Francis Ford Coppola was brought into the editing room, a shocking move for a project of this scale. He reworked the structure, reshaped scenes, and attempted to refine tone, but even his influence could not unify the fractured material. What remained was a film built from incompatible pieces, each reflecting a different director's attempt to fix the one before it. The promotional campaign tried to disguise the instability, but audiences sensed the dissonance. Supernova felt like several movies layered awkwardly atop one another, echoing the chaos of its creation. Its legacy is not defined by what it achieved, but by the story of how many times it was reinvented in desperation. Some films lose their way during production. This one lost itself every time someone tried to save it. Sometimes a movie doesn't collapse because of one bad decision, but because too many hands try to reshape a vision that was never allowed to solidify. Bonus fact: Dominion. Prequel to The Exorcist, 2005. Some films are forgotten because they were ignored, but others vanish because they were never given the space to exist in the first place. Dominion. Prequel to The Exorcist is one of the rare examples where a completed movie, fully shot and assembled with the intent of sincerity, was quietly buried before it ever reached the public. It became a ghost in its own franchise, the film that lost a battle no one outside the studio was supposed to know about. Dominion was Paul Schrader's original vision for The Exorcist prequel, a colder and more contemplative story exploring faith, guilt, and the brittle psychology of a man struggling to understand the presence of evil. Instead of spectacle, it leaned toward thematic weight. Instead of terror, it pursued dread. But the studio, nervous after test screenings and disheartened by the absence of traditional horror beats, rejected it outright. They didn't want a meditation on spiritual collapse, they wanted a commercial hit. So the film was shelved, and the studio remade it almost entirely under a new director, turning it into the more aggressive Exorcist. The beginning. For a time, Dominion existed only as rumor discussed quietly, denied publicly, overshadowed by the louder release that replaced it. Only later was it reluctantly allowed to surface, a version shaped long before fear drove the studio toward a safer path. Watching Dominion now feels like discovering a lost confession. It is imperfect, uneven, but unmistakably honest, a reminder of how many films are altered not because they failed, but because they were never trusted enough to be seen. Some films fail on screen, others were never even allowed to fail. Across these 5 films, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Cinema is never just what appears on the screen. It is shaped in rooms the audience never sees, influenced by decisions made far from the set, and transformed by fears that rarely belong to the filmmakers. Each of these stories, fractured visions, lost cuts, abandoned ideas, reveals how fragile authorship becomes when a studio's expectations overshadow artistic intent. What survives is often not the film that was imagined, but the film that was permitted. Yet hidden beneath the reshoots, the edits, and the compromises, something still lingers. Justice League's rebirth showed the power of persistence. Solo revealed the cost of protecting a legacy. American History 10 exposed how conflicting truths can split a story in two. Exorcist. The beginning and its buried counterpart demonstrated how easily a narrative can be rewritten out of fear. And Supernova, reshaped again and again, became a reminder of how chaotic the search for a safer film can be. These movies do more than entertain. They ask a question that echoes beyond their troubled productions. How many stories have we watched that were never allowed to tell the truth? How many frames were removed before they ever reached us? And if the real version of a film can disappear so easily, what else has vanished with it? So now the question is yours to answer. Which of these films revealed too much, and which one deserved to be seen uncensored? Real Secrets, where the truth was always in the edit,